När ett barn blir allvarligt sjukt behöver du hantera en ny vardag. Men det finns stöd att få. Ronald McDonald Hus ger familjer möjligheten att bo tillsammans medan barnet vårdas på sjukhus. Vill du ge fler familjer samma möjlighet? Swisha till 970 22.
Antalet barn och ungdomar som vänder sig till vården för att de upplever att de är födda i fel kön, vilket kallas könsdysfori, har ökat lavinartat på senare år i Sverige. 1998 var andelen av befolkningen som diagnosticerats med könsdysfori strax över 0 av 100 000 invånare och 10 år senare så låg det på totalt 31 personer. 10 år senare än det så hade det ökat med 2300% till 727 personer per 100 000 invånare. Totalt då 2018 hade 5841 personer, en av 1700, någon sorts könsdysforidiagnos i Sverige. Men sedan den 1 maj i år så har Karolinska sjukhuset bestämt att stoppa all hormonbehandling och pubertetsblockerare till minderåriga eftersom några av de potentiella biverkningarna är kardiovaskulär sjukdom, benskörhet, infertilitet, cancer och trombossjukdom. Vi vet för lite, säger Karolinska sjukhuset nu. I ett tidigare avsnitt av den här podden, det var det andra avsnittet, så pratade jag med Alexa Lundberg som är transkvinna. Idag ångrar hon sin transition till kvinna, även om hon fortfarande är väldigt noggrann med att poängtera att hon stöttar möjligheten att göra det. Men att det inte var rätt för henne. Och det här tycker jag är en fråga som behöver diskuteras mer, de som ångrar sig. Och det här fenomenet är inte, transfrågan är inte isolerat i Sverige utan det sker i hela västvärlden, den här ökningen. Och det är just flickor som i puberteten eller i tonåren på väldigt kort tid bestämmer sig för att de är födda i fel kön eller att de har då könsdysfori. Och det är det som ökar, det är det som står för den här stora ökningen. I dagens podd så pratar jag med den amerikanska journalisten Abigail Shrier som skriver för bland annat Wall Street Journal och The Federalist. Men hon är i podden idag för att prata om sin senaste bok som handlar om just transfrågan. För den har nyligen översatts till svenska med titeln Irreversibel skada, Transepidemin som drabbar våra döttrar, och den ges ut på Karnevalförlag. Och det är en bok som verkligen ger inblick i hur det kan vara för de som går igenom könsdysfori och hur det påverkar familjer där det här sker, där deras föräldrar vars barn får könsdysfori på väldigt kort tid. Jag hoppas att samtalet gör boken rättvisa, men jag rekommenderar verkligen den som vill fördjupa sig att läsa boken på egen hand, för det är väldigt många berättelser och ganska gripande, ärligt talat, att få följa med så många olika människor på allting de går igenom och hur de möter läkare, terapeuter. Läs boken. Nu till dagens gäst Abigail Shrier. Du lyssnar på Rak Höger med mig, Ivar Arpi. So welcome Abigail Shrier to Rak Höger.
Thank you so much for having me on.
So it's a great pleasure to have a fellow Substacker on the podcast. I said that before we started recording, and you didn't know I was on Substack, but that's because I write in Swedish. Otherwise, I would be world famous, I believe. So,
I have no doubt.
But you've been on Substack since January.
Yes, that's right.
It's not your full-time gig.
Well, you know, I still get requests from other outlets, and occasionally I contribute to them as well. Sometimes I find it useful to contribute to other publications, especially because I tend to break a lot of investigations. So I usually have a deal with publications I write for that they allow me to print on my Substack within 24 hours. So I'll do, 24 hours for them and then goes right to my Substack. The reason I sometimes like to do it is I break a lot of news, and sometimes it's nice to have the credibility of having editors read it over and say, we looked into this, she's right. Because some of the stuff is really so unbelievable that sometimes it's hard to trust journalists.
Yes, it's a growing issue with the reporting coming out of the United States, I would say. I used to think that Sweden was an outlier in everything crazy and politically correct, but I think you've surpassed us in the last few years.
Yes, we really seem to excel at crazy here in the United States.
Well, I could talk about Substack because I think it's interesting because it's my livelihood now. But that's not the reason that I invited you on but it's because you've written a great book which is called Irreversible Damage in English and Irreversibel skada, Transepidemin som drabbar våra döttrar in Swedish. And it recently came out here. And from what I can see, only a Christian paper has reviewed your book so far. And I hope this will change because it's a great book. And the issue that you describe is sort of crazy. And I mean, I've written a little bit about it, but basically what you describe is that it's a non-existent phenomena, which in a few years exploded. And now it's a growing issue in basically all the Western countries, I would say, and you describe and you bring up Sweden as well, Great Britain, United States, Canada. Perhaps it varies a little bit, but and it's adolescent girls overnight finding out or coming up with the idea that they're born in the wrong body or they're having gender dysphoria, and they overnight say that I identify as a man or as a boy, and I want to change. Could you describe why did you start to write this book in the first place?
So I wrote this book because we were seeing across the West, and you're very much seeing the same thing in Sweden, which is why I hope readers can become aware of this. That is the sudden, unexplained spike in teenage girls deciding they were transgender and really asking for hormones and surgeries and easily getting them. And the strange thing about this was we know what gender dysphoria is. We have a 100-year diagnostic history, and it never was in teenage girls. It was something that typified teenage girls. In fact, it was overwhelmingly male, and it always emerged in early childhood, ages 2 to 4. Little boys saying, "No, mommy, I'm not a boy, I'm a girl." And now in the last decade, out of nowhere, the leading demographic is teenage girls with no childhood history of gender dysphoria, claiming to have it, insisting they have it, and just being handed testosterones and surgery and provided with surgeries by affirming doctors who do not question them.
What is very captivating with your book, because we have statistics and you can read short summaries on government agencies and how much the prevalence of this, and it's all useful information. And I mean, I think between year 1998 and 2018, the prevalence of teenage girls with a gender dysphoria diagnosis, it jumped 2,300% in Sweden in a 20-year period. So it was basically non-existent to being one of the much more prevalent than what you described with the young boys wanting to be girls. But what you do in your book is that you made 200 interviews and you spoke to dozens of families. And so you really get a view of what's happening in their individual lives. And you see certain commonalities in how they have difficulties in certain areas. But perhaps you could describe what the commonalities for these girls are.
Sure, they're the same population of girls that falls for every other social contagion. In America, we had anorexia, cutting, these sorts of things. It's affluent and upper middle class and upper middle class white girls. Very precocious. These are very, very bright young girls, but they don't always fit in socially. They're very tied to their mothers, and they really struggle to fit in with their peers. And this becomes a way that they are able to be celebrated at school and become part of a club without having to face the fact that they have no other sort of attractive identity to today's youth.
What is a social contagion? Because that word, when you translate that to Swedish, it sounds awful. I'm not sure. I'm not sure how much if it sounds more awful in Swedish, but it's really like disease, födda is the word, and the contagion, I'm not sure if it's more neutral, but it's not that you use the word craze as well as a sociological term, and I believe social contagion is a applicable term. But could you describe it so we stay clear of the most of the harm we are inflicting upon people with just using the term?
Yes, absolutely. So we know that teenagers tend to share and spread different forms of pain. Now, we've also seen how, non-harmful things that are not harmful can also be a craze. So for instance, in the United States, hula hoops, this old, this fun toy became a tremendous craze. Every teenager wanted one, every young person wanted one because all of their friends had it. And we've also seen that harmful behaviors can be spread in this way. So there's a writer, Lee Daniel Kravitz, an American writer, who talked about how a little more than a decade ago, there were a spate of suicides in the same high school in Palo Alto, California, that the kids were very anxious and they were imitating each other once it became sort of a celebrated thing. And I think that I try to show in my book, and I believe it's true, that transgender identity can be a social contagion, meaning young girls can encourage each other. Oh, I feel dysphoric. Do you feel this? I hate my body. Do you hate your body? I hate my body. Oh, I'm totally trans, this kind of thing. And they're spreading this identity in numbers that far outstrip what we've ever seen of people with actual gender dysphoria. The numbers really don't make sense. And if you look at the fact that there's such a high rate of prevalence within friend groups, this is teenage girls' friend groups coming out as trans, really the only way to understand this is peer contagion.
I felt a little bit old when I read your book because I'm a couple of years younger than you, but so I'm indirectly calling you old, but I'm a millennial and you're Generation X, but it's only my wife is in between. But when you describe how teenage life has changed since you were a teenager and since I was a teenager, of course I grew up in Sweden, but we used to hang out and we were outside and we were at parties every Friday and people drank too much. And I mean, there were a lot of risk taking, but we met each other and hung out a lot. But now what you describe, and which fits into this hypothesis of social contagion, is that a lot of these girls find their peer group not at the mall, because the mall has closed and been replaced by Amazon, but rather on social forums such as DeviantArt, Tumblr, Reddit, Instagram, and that changed. And could you please describe that?
Sure,
that change?
TikTok. Yes.
TikTok.
So the difference is if girls felt uncomfortable in their bodies, and let me just say, every girl going through puberty feels uncomfortable in her body. It's a dramatic and painful change. Menarche is, very uncomfortable, and developing breasts. It's all very strange and uncomfortable for a young woman. They used to commiserate with each other in person, or that you would talk about things and feel better. And today they're going online, they're Googling, I hate my body. And they're getting influencers who are, YouTube stars, TikTok stars, who are telling them if they feel uncomfortable in their body, they're probably trans. And unfortunately, young people today spend so much time with these influencers and so little time with each other. They're really listening to some very bad influences.
This also, I mean, I'm a anxious middle-class parent to 4 very young kids, but we talk a lot about screen time here in Sweden, and one of your advices is that you should perhaps monitor that closely during this phase of a kid's life. The authority of parents, or the closeness of parents and the relationship with the parents, become undermined by this online peer group. So that didn't lessen my anxiety going into my kids' older ages.
Well, I think it should.
Yeah.
I think it should, because I'll tell you why. Because a smartphone is such a vector of mental health problem for these young people. It really, taking that away, you've already given your child such an advantage. If you don't give them a smartphone, there are a lot of other kinds of phones. They have flip phones out there. But taking away the social media and YouTube, these things are so bad for teenage girls. And taking those things away is a really easy way. Although I know it's difficult. I know they protest, but it's a really an easy way to set your kid up for a much better life.
You also describe, I mean, because this is basically about teenage girls or our daughters and young women. I mean, I have a lot of anecdotes of I have younger cousins and people I know, and one of the things that I know is that they have had in schools, they had competitions in like they are high achieving, they get best grades, but they also compete with weight. You describe also how in anorectic girls and bulimic girls, they find online info on how to fool the parents, and this is like a new thing. I think that you can. It's basically like you can learn how to build a bomb online as well, and this is sort of course you will find information on any subject. So perhaps I should not be surprised, but I was surprised when I read that.
It is a little surprising. It's very different from adults. Adults don't sit around thinking about how can I hurt myself or these negative emotions. We've passed through adolescence. So, we've gotten to a stage where we make decisions about our lives, but they're not because other teenagers would approve of them. And that's the biggest difference between teenagers and adults. Adults do all kinds of things they may regret, things that are reckless or foolish. Okay. But we don't usually do it to impress our friends. But teenagers, we know, do. We've measured this. So many psychological studies show that teenagers are really guided by peer approval, and they will do even harmful things to themselves for the sake of peer approval. And they like this kind of stuff. I mean, there's a lot of ways to self-harm that are documented and explored and celebrated on social media. And this is just not the sort of thing that adults tutor each other in, but it is very much the province of teenagers.
You bring up Jonathan Haidt, and he wrote the book and the article together with Greg Lukianoff, Coddling of the American Mind, and where he describes how many of these practices that teenagers use and the culture, the sort of woke culture, the victim culture, it's the opposite of cognitive behavioral therapy. So you increase your victimhood and your vulnerability, and you grow that instead of trying to develop a thick skin. So, for example, in that book, he brings, and you make an example of this as well. And you learn in CBT, you learn to separate the immediate feeling and the reality. So you learn to think that, okay, this is the reaction I feel, but it's not the actual reality, so that you can realize that, okay, the negative emotions I have is temporary and I have to get closer to reality. But this is the opposite in this when you come, and so you learn that the feeling is actually the reality. So if you have this negative, yeah.
Yes, all this ideology is very invested in the idea that we are unwell, that teenagers are unwell, and they are permanently unwell. We are permanent victim classes. And that is the way to get celebrated today in school. It's a way to get celebrated by their peers, but also their teachers. Therapists can't wait to affirm young teenagers, because now they say, oh, that's wonderful. Yes, we'll keep this from your parents. They don't understand you, but I do. And this is the sort of refrain of a lot of affirmative therapists, although it is, often, sort of subtle. They say, oh, I'm just affirming a child's identity, true identity. She can't escape this, as if a teenager is born non-binary. I mean, these are literally identities that were invented yesterday on the internet, and we're all supposed to pretend they're immutable characteristics like being gay.
This is one of the most heartbreaking parts of the book, because you describe how these young women, and many have had very close relationships with their parents and their moms, and then their gender dysphoria comes along, and many of them just break sort of it perhaps it's not sudden, but because if they don't affirm their new identity overnight and use their new pronouns and their new taken name, then they are creating an unsafe environment. So you're basically having like a conversion and then a split from the family in many of the cases you describe.
Yes, there's a lot of family alienation with this population. And it's the reason, it really is the reason I wrote the book, is that by objective measures, these girls who are trans identifying suddenly and transitioning were doing terribly. And when I say objective measures, I looked at things like family alienation, cutting off their family, cutting off all their friends who weren't trans, dropping out of school, getting menial jobs, covering themselves in tattoos and constantly updating them. They never seemed happy or healthy in their bodies, even after transition, and they weren't forming many meaningful, stable relationships. By and large, they were getting subsistence work at a local coffee shop, but these kids were very, very bright kids who should have been going on to college and should have stayed in college, and very often they weren't.
I don't remember now which one of the cases that you described, but of course the parents wanted to help because many of them, and this is true, this is true scientifically in Sweden as well, that many of these young women and girls suffer from other issues such as autism spectrum disorders and ADHD or depression, self-harm behaviors, and much higher rates than in the general population. So of course parents want to help them and bring them to psychiatrists, and then one of them, like one of the therapists, said that in a few of these cases they suggest that it's gender dysphoria, so they plant sort of the seed.
Yes, in America, the seed gets planted by many people, teachers, social workers, therapists the parents pay for, gender doctors the parents pay for. And in almost every case, the message that the adults give to this child, and remember the child could be 12 years old, is if your parents don't affirm you, if they don't acknowledge your trans identity, if they don't allow you to transition, then they are unsafe. So you see, there was a lot of breaking away from parents by these young people. And of course, the parents I interviewed really did want the best for their daughters. They were not homophobic. They were not anti-LGBTQ. Most of them were political progressive. They just didn't believe this was right for their daughters.
You bring up statistics like how many of them that are supportive of trans rights, and I don't remember the exact number, but it was around 88%. I think it was 88% or to some hovered around there. I mean, there must be a difference to object that your 12-year-old starts hormonal therapy and supporting an adult decision to transition. I mean, it should be a level of difference in your if it's transphobia to object to hormonal therapy for a 12-year-old, then it's a very mild form compared to then being just against the whole category of people and nobody should ever transition.
That's right. It's very different. Adults make decisions, first of all, because they've grown up, they've achieved a certain maturity. And if this is how they want to present to the world, I fully support that. I've never had expressed any concern with that. And I'll tell you something else. Here in Sweden, your own Karolinska Hospital recently cut back on the transitioning of minors because of the risks. There's a lot of medical risks that were really underexplored, including the possibility of regret. And we're seeing very high rates of regret among this population.
It's strange because when you talk about steroids use in sports, you're very open about all the risks. So it's basically a lot of it for a woman to have that level of testosterone in her body. It's very similar to using steroids for performance enhancement when it comes to risks in cancer and stuff like that. So it's strange because you have to have a double mindset medically when you talk about these issues.
Right. And of course, the doses we're giving to women are far, far higher. We're talking about 10 to 40 times what her body is meant to handle. So we know that, she has real risk, not only of the cancers that you mentioned, like endometrial cancer, but also uterine atrophy, vaginal atrophy. There's a
Det är festivalsäsong och det betyder massor av lera. Så Alex surfade in på Amazon för att hitta ett tält som rymmer upp till 5 torra vänner, en mysig campingsäng, skön och leopardmönstrade gummistövlar. Miau! Nu får Alex hantera precis lagom mycket lera för att vara Alex, vilket är betydligt mindre lera än för den där leriga dansande mannen där borta. Men vänta, har han bara lera på sig? Japp, bara lera. Håll dig torr, får det att hända. Hitta det på amazon.se.
Upptäck Ford e-Custom, elversionen av Europas mest sålda transportbil. Den har upp till 370 kilometers räckvidd, snabbladdning och finns nu med 4-hjulsdrift. Just nu till Ford Pro Edition-pris från 479 000 ex-moms. Läs mer på Ford.se eller besök din Ford-återförsäljare. Ready, set, Ford.
Tänk om din plånbok kunde prata. Vad skulle den då säga om din relation till ekonomi?
Alla relationer har ju sina ups and downs. Men att han har lån lite här och där, det tror jag skulle vara en ick för rätt många plånböcker och inte bara för mig.
Ett första steg mot en bättre relation till sin plånbok kan vara att samla sina lån.
Samla dina lån till ett på lendo.se.
A lot of painful risks. Her urethra can begin to disintegrate. It's called friable is the medical term, from the testosterone. So there's tremendous numbers of these risks. And of course, she'll have physical changes that won't go back. So for instance, she may have a permanent 5 o'clock shadow. You know, her stubble on her face may be permanent. The voice change may be permanent, and facial features and whatnot. But these are huge risks, and they're treated as if they are nothing by a medical community that has really stopped acting like doctors, at least in America. And they really just act like activists. They sit around celebrating this without applying the typical medical skepticism that we would want them to use for any serious treatment.
So this is the title of your book, basically, Irreversible Damage. If it was sort of, okay, my child has become a punk rocker. A piercing, you can remove a piercing. It's not,
Right.
it won't cause you to not be able to have a child. If you start a hormonal treatment as a young female and you do it for sufficient amount of time, then you might become sterile. So it's irreversible. And the same with boys, even if that's not the main subject in your book. But if you use estrogen and you do these changes and you remove your penis, and then those changes are also irreversible after a while. So you have in some cases you have like a window of time where it's still reversible. Then you take up another category in your book, and that's the detransitioning movement and the traitors, so to speak, to this because they are not talked about so much because they complicate the image. Could you just describe like what that is?
Yes. So detransitioners are, they could be men or women, but most often young women who went through these changes very quickly. The famous Kira Bell case, Kira was one in England, in which she said to the High Court, it takes enormous bravery to be able to do this. I was 16 when you started me on these treatments. I had no way of knowing that this was right for me. No doctors questioned me. They just pushed me onto all these hormones and surgeries. Now I have no breasts. I'm probably infertile, and I made a huge mistake. This did not cure my problem. And what I had probably wasn't, typical gender dysphoria at all. So I think, this is a population that ought to be listened to. At least they should give doctors pause. But in the United States, they are instead attacked, insulted, ignored. Activists call for them anything that they're calling them transphobic. Anytime that they speak up and share their own experience, activists do their best to block it, to censor it, to shut it down. It is completely wrong. And they are the only group that is not allowed to be part of this conversation.
It's very interesting because you interview Buck Angel. So perhaps you could introduce the audience to Buck Angel if they're not heard of him before.
So Buck Angel is a trans man, meaning he was born a woman, and he transitioned as a man. He's now a sort of internationally known porn star, in addition to being a health advocate for transgender people. And he was very kindly allowed me to interview him for my book. And he said, listen, I did this as an adult, as a mature adult. I made this decision. I always had gender dysphoria from the time I was a little girl. And it took years of therapy, but this was right for me. He said, but these kids, they're going way too fast and they're encouraging each other on social media and they're encouraging their peers and nobody is giving them proper medical oversight to make sure this is right for them. He believes it's way too fast and way too young. And that's coming from someone who's transgender.
He's been labeled a transphobe as well, but it's a harder case to make when you've been a public advocate for trans rights for such a long time. But I actually interviewed a Swedish woman named Alexa Lundberg a couple of months ago. So was born a boy and transitioned to a woman, but regrets the choice because she thinks that she was really a gay man and she was taken in, like she was admired a lot of the feminine characteristics and met a couple of trans women, and so he was inspired, but now regrets the decision. She nowadays call her like a gay girl, like a homo girl, so to speak. It's a story that's not been told so many times, and you can actually combine being supportive of trans rights without thinking that you should do this for kids and adolescents.
Right, absolutely. I mean, remember that this really has nothing to do with transgender rights at all. This is a question of whether we would approach their medical care the way we approach every other kind of medical care, which is honestly with evidence and really taking the risks very seriously to make sure they get the best care. And instead, because in the US, it's become so politicized, and in fact, across the Western world, it's become so politicized, doctors are not treating it the same. They're not treating it with the same sobriety and the same concern for harm. And does this medication cause harm? Of course. It causes a lot of harm. And that's why we need to be aware of it and really honest about it and careful when administering these treatments. And instead, there's been, doctors have just looked the other way and really they're making so much money on these things in the United States. And across the West, it's just become so popular that they really aren't behaving like doctors.
So the argument against this and against you writing this book and giving this issue and me inviting you and we're talking about this like this is that we are causing harm now. We are actually with this podcast and your book and people researching this and the scientist who came up with who had the hypothesis that this was maybe a social contagion. That's also harmful because what we are doing now is they mean the activists that this gender dysphoria, they need to transition fast so that they can pass as the other sex. And if they don't do that, then that will cause many of them to commit suicide.
That is a series of exaggeration and lies. First of all, the idea that my book causes harm, my book just points out the medical risks. There are hundreds of books that are entirely uncritical of gender affirming surgeries and treatments for teenagers. They're all on Amazon. No one objects to them. And all they are is celebrating immediate affirmation and hormonal and surgical treatments. And somehow one book looking at the risks is enough to cause harm. That's such a perversion of the truth. The truth is anyone who cares about transgender health wants proper medical oversight and an honest discussion of the risks. It's the only way to give people good treatment. And they know that. So they really do this as just a way of shutting you down. And unfortunately, they have been very successful. They have tried to censor me. Target removed my book. It put it back on after people objected, then took it down again. Amazon has played all kinds of games with my book. But at the end of the day, people want to know about the risks. So they go out and buy it and they are entitled to read for themselves and decide what they think. That's something we all used to agree on. And unfortunately, the so-called woke, they don't believe in free speech.
There was another case. You bring up Amazon suspended a paid advertising campaign of your book, and then there was a positive review of your book was published on the website Science-Based Medicine in June this year, and the editors retracted the review and said that it was just anecdotes, outliers, political discussions, and cherry-picked science in your book.
Right. So they actually removed one of their best writers, one of their longest running and most, highest contributing writers. They removed, and she's a doctor. She wrote a favorable review of my book. They removed it and then proceeded to publish, 4 or 5 reviews that were negative of my book, many of which included not only tons of factual errors, but they actually invented quotes from my book that never appeared in the book. You're talking about a publication with no integrity whatsoever. And unfortunately, we're seeing that all over. I mean, if you type in my book on Amazon, you'll see that my book recommends, they will say customers who bought this book also bought, and they will recommend other books. There's not a single book on Amazon, as far as I can tell, that recommends my book, even though it was a bestseller, because they are doing everything they can to try to get you not to buy it.
This was not on the list of topics, but it's very interesting because you can see how different, like the woke industry, actually it has become part of capitalism now. So Amazon and Google and so basically these companies, they are also in on it, so to speak. So they are very susceptible to critique from the woke community or the woke communities. So they or maybe the people there have the same values. I have many of them live in the same areas in these companies like Silicon Valley, so they have a lot of these values in common.
That's right, they do.
That's a really like a scary prospect that your book, people want to read it, and it's a well-researched book, and it's not like you're a crackpot. Even if you were a crackpot and had written the exact same book, it would still be a good book. So, but you're an established journalist and writer. So, if it happens to you, then it could happen to anyone. I mean,
that's the thing to know. It really can, and people aren't aware of that until it comes for them. But I can tell you, it could really happen to anyone. They are tightening the circle of allowable speech. And it's getting narrower. It's not getting broader. It's not like they'll stop with gender. They won't. And we have seen they're willing to lose money. They're willing to do anything to stop certain ideas from getting out. So I think it's extremely worrisome, and it should be to any free society, because this is not how evidence gets exposed. This is not how systems or medical care or any system improves. It doesn't improve by shutting up evidence or shutting up journalists, but that's certainly what we're seeing in America.
I've brought this up before here, but even the word woman has become sort of a hate word, a turf word. Trans-exclusionary radical feminists use the word woman because it's actually a thing. There is a certain group of people that were called women, and now in Sweden you replaced this word with other words. So in the United States there was a Cori Bush, who was a congressional representative for the Democrats. She said that she would do anything to save black birthing persons last year. And so the same thing is happening in Sweden with our governmental agencies saying that we should, that medical practitioners should avoid the word woman. So you're having a ramp up of the efforts to even control the language, as you're talking about. I mean, it's and this is happening in Sweden, and it's happening in the United States. And we didn't talk about this. I'm going back in the discussion now, but you describe yourself as sort of when you grew up, you were sort of a tomboy, but that's like a category, being a tomboy or being a lesbian even. That's sort of categories that don't really exist now, or has to a much lesser degree, because if you're a tomboy, then perhaps you should transition. Perhaps you're gender dysphoric.
That's right. There's a tremendous amount of pressure on young women if they're not perfectly feminine today. And as you said, we're seeing really a whole-scale assault on women's rights coming out of this same ideology. You can't even say the word woman. And we're seeing this, across American law as well, where they're removing the word woman and they're trying to remove sex-based rights. So any entitlement a woman has to being in a women's only battered women's shelter or prison is now under assault across the United States and in other countries as well. And women are getting badly hurt.
You wrote a piece. This is it ties into your book, but it's sort of a separate issue or a larger issue. You wrote a piece on your Substack, which is called abigailschreier.substack.com. So I really recommend people to go in and subscribe. And you wrote a piece because the title, "Want to Save America, Don't Act Like a Conservative." So I thought that was a great headline. Like one journalist to another, that's a great headline.
Thank you.
It's sort of, as someone who identifies sort of like a conservative, it's like, oh, okay, how am I going to act then? But could you just describe, because it has to do with what you are doing and what another journalist, Chris Rufo, is doing, and why shouldn't you act like a conservative if we want to change these issues?
Right. I think there are two sort of conservative impulses, certainly in America. And one is to be overly polite and solicitous on anything that has to do with the culture, because we feel like, I don't really know about this whole LGBTQ thing, so I'm just going to do whatever they ask me to and be very polite. And I don't want to offend them. I just want them out of my house. As long as they have nothing, it's the fantasy that what goes on in the culture has nothing to do with your family and your country. It has everything to do with that. But conservatives traditionally haven't wanted to really engage the culture. They've sort of wanted to oppose a lot of things, but not engage it. And on the other hand, you have this sort of aggressive, what I call chest thumping conservatives. They oppose everything. They come across very often as bigoted, and they know that everything's going on in the culture is bad or wrong, and they decry it, but they don't give good arguments against it. They don't seem to know why they're arguing against something. And I think Chris Rufo and something that I try to do is to take a middle path, that is to honestly engage what's going on in the culture and figure out if there are things to be concerned about and explain why in a way that's accessible across the political spectrum. And that's certainly what I tried to do in the book. Look, I didn't approach it as all conservatives should think this, which seems to be the mode that so many conservatives operate in. I don't really care what conservatives believe so much. Really, I'm interested in what should thinking people believe, what should people who care about evidence believe, and what should people who care about the well-being of young women believe. And if there's evidence that they're not doing very well and that all this trans identification is hurting them rather than helping them, and that doctors are not taking enough care to make sure that they're getting proper treatment, well, that's something we should all be concerned about.
I'm familiar with like Chris Rufo is doing. He's the one in like 1 year. He's done more in the culture war as a lone ranger sort of act than many has done in many years. But what he's done is he started a activism sort of. He with his Twitter page and his own homepage, he got a lot of parents who wrote to him and about the critical race theory and what was happening at their children's schools. And so it ties into this whole culture war where trans rights and intersectionality is sort of a woke mix. So he started publishing that on Twitter. So I've been following him for quite some time. And then people started reaching out to him and like, okay, so what could we do? Could we prevent this? Could we introduce legislation to help combat this? And he was like, sure, I'll help you. And so he's helped a lot of states and a lot of parents to combat this. And then a lot of conservatives started getting angry and critical because they are also critical against critical race theory. But this proactive stance that Chris Rufo has taken didn't sit well with them. And why? Could you explain why? He was winning.
I think that most of the opposition to him has come from the left, but I do think there was jealousy on the right. I do. I mean, he's been enormously effective at identifying a problem that we should all care about, which is the racial indoctrination of our children. They're indoctrinated in racism, into seeing each other based on a racial hierarchy. This is a really sick thing that really America, this is absolutely part of American values to oppose this. So I think he's done a marvelous job. And I think that, I take less of an activist role. I tend to more want to expose the phenomena, but I have not worked in the policy realm. I leave that to others. But I think he's been marvelously effective. And I think that's what people upsets people is jealousy more than anything, because they like to sit around in think tanks and accomplish nothing.
It's not perhaps the most savory comparison, but I know Baader Meinhof, the terrorist group in West Germany, they wrote a really fun article where they criticized the left and said that they have more anxiety with getting a citation in their disputation wrong than actually doing something out in the real world. And I think that applies to conservatives sometimes as well. Like, we must get the terminology right, and it must be, the definition must be specific, and it must be exact, and it must be in this way. And people it hasn't worked very well in the culture war, and that attitude.
I think it's done horribly. I mean, frankly, liberals haven't done so well either. To be fair, why? Because these are all values liberals share: free speech, free expression, religious liberty. Liberals share all of those, and yet they're all being eroded, and they're under terrible attack right now. And who's been effective? The woke activists. They've gone in, they've taken over schools, they've taken over medical accrediting organizations. And they have replaced scientific method and thought and open and honest discussion with ideology. And it's a huge problem. But yes, you also see it among conservatives who are much more comfortable with their old debates. They want to return to the old debates. They want to sit around in think tanks and talk about what conservatism should be, rather than actually accomplishing anything in the broader culture.
Yeah, and quote Milton Friedman and Hayek and batter each other with the quotations from that.
Yes.
Let's stop with the culture war and talk about taxes again, shall we?
Exactly. That's what they're most comfortable with, and that's what they're achieving. Great Hayek citations.
Yeah. And you had a great picture of Mitt Romney. It was very mean, but very fitting, because he's one of those conservatives who gladly marched with Black Lives Matter and disregarded all the warning signals, like what am I doing here, and what's wrong with this movement? I mean, he's a great virtue signaler.
I wouldn't pick on these people if the stakes weren't so high. But we are literally losing our liberties in America. So free speech has never been more suppressed than and certainly in my lifetime. Religious liberty has never been so under assault. Due process has never been so corroded. And so I don't really think it's the time to sit around and sit around in think tanks and accomplishing very little. It's really time to engage the culture.
So what is how has your when this book was published and the debate after? So what's your position now, and what's happening now with you in this time and space that we're living in?
You know what? I think the book has had a bigger impact than I ever could have imagined. Certainly the High Court in England talked to the same sources that were in my book. The High Court opinion came out, I think, 6 months after my book. It was in December. My book was published in June. And you have seen the same sources used elsewhere. We now have all kinds of bills in America. I think there were over 50 bills regarding the transgender treatment of minors. And the reason that's important is at least we're now having a discussion of the risks and the appropriateness, whereas there was no discussion before. So, and the book, sold very well in America and is selling right now, as far as I know, in Spain, which it just debuted in this week. So we're seeing in other countries, they're picking up on the idea that this is a social contagion. We have to be concerned about it. And we have to ask a lot of questions about these treatments before you shoot up my daughter.
Thank you very much, Abigail Schreier, for being part of Rak Höger.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Och stort tack till dig som har lyssnat. Detta är alltså en del av en större publikation på Substack med samma namn som podden. Den som prenumererar där får 2 texter i veckan utöver den här podden varje söndag. Gillar man det man läser och hör så får man gärna bli betalande prenumerant för 5 euro i månaden eller 50 om året. Och då får man också ta del av lite extra material som är exklusivt för betalande prenumeranter. Du hittar rubbet på ivararpi.se. Och har du några frågor eller synpunkter kan du alltid mejla mig på ivararpi@substack.com. Vi hörs om en vecka.